Well, good evening and welcome to our second class of three, Back to the Basics, the Jewish Cycle of Life. This session will cover Brit, covenant. We're going to look at birth, conversion, and B'nai Mitzvah. We'll only look at B'nai Mitzvah if we have time, which we may or may not. I hope to conclude around 8:45, between 8:45 and 9. And this session is being recorded, so if you missed it in person, welcome, and I hope you enjoy this recording. Feel free to interrupt with questions or thoughts as we go, and I hope you'll enjoy this refreshing, like a different kind of take, a new look at this topic, which maybe we haven't delved into in depth. I find in my work with young parents that those first few weeks of life of a child are not necessarily ones where you are able to retain a lot of memory about what's going on. And so sometimes our experience of the rituals that pertain to welcoming children to the covenant are ones which we ourselves don't really remember for our own kids. So I'm hoping that this in-depth look will give a different kind of perspective. So do interrupt or ask questions at any point, and I hope you enjoy. So we can't talk about covenant and Brit without our biblical source. Now, if I'm gonna, let me see, Mark, would you be willing to read for us in English? You have to unmute.
I'm glad you asked me to read it in English. God further said to Abraham, "As for you, you and your offspring to come throughout the ages shall keep my covenant. Such shall be the covenant between me and you and your offspring to follow, which you shall keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and that shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you." Should I keep going?
Yeah, just read the whole thing.
Okay, and for all the generations, every male among you shall be circumcised at the age of 8 days. As for the homeborn slave and the one bought from an outsider who is not of your offspring, they must be circumcised, homeborn and purchased alike. Thus shall my covenant be marked in your flesh as an everlasting pact. And if any male who is uncircumcised fails to circumcise the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his kin. He has broken my covenant.
All right, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but before we go on, does anyone have any reflections or thoughts, something that you notice about this passage?
I just wondered why we couldn't have just notched an ear.
Yeah, sure. There's something uncomfortable or taboo about the foreskin of the penis, certainly.
Yeah.
All right.
The slaves.
Oh, great. So it's not just
not just
Jewish people who are Jewish by birth, but also people who are Jewish by association. The slaves in the ancient world were a part of your household. Certainly that's the way the Bible understands slavery. They didn't really think about chattel slavery in the American South sense of slavery, but slavery were members of your household, and members of your household had to be included within this covenant. Okay. Other things that you notice? I guess for me, the thing that is glaringly obvious that jumps out over and over is the repetition of the word brit, covenant, right? It occurs 7 times, 6 times, a lot of times in this passage. Et briti tishmor, in the first verse here. Then Zot briti, laot brit, Haita briti bivsarchem, fin et briti hefer, right? So brit comes back over and over and over. And that's our topic. Our topic is the idea of covenant, the idea of brit. And we're going to look at that in some different ways.
Rabbi, Barry and I are going to go off video while we have our supper, but we're here.
Great. Okay. So we're going to jump to our Talmudic source. And this Talmudic source reflects the obligations of parents to their children. Anita, would you read for us from Kiddushin 29a?
Parents are obligated with regard to their children to circumcise them and to redeem them if they are a firstborn who must be redeemed by a payment to a priest, and to teach them Torah, and to marry them, and to teach them a trade. And some say parents also obligated to teach their children to swim. The Talmud teaches that parents are obligated to circumcise their son. The Gemara asks, where do we derive this? From where do we derive this? The Gemara answers that this is as it is written, and Abraham circumcised his son Isaac. The Gemara comments, and in a case where one's parents did not circumcise him, the court is obligated to circumcise him. That is, if his obligation is not fulfilled by the parents, it applies to the community as a whole, as it is written, every male among you shall be circumcised, in the form of a general mitzvah that does not apply only to the parents. And in a case where the court did not circumcise him, the son is obligated to circumcise himself when he reaches adulthood, as it is written, and the uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that soul shall be cut off from his people.
Right. So, in other words, there's a text, an early text, a Tannaitic text, not contained in the Mishnah, but in the collection of material that occurs at the same time as the Mishnah, called the Tosefta. And that text is the first bullet point, the second bullet point here, the one that says parents are obligated to circumcise their children and to redeem them and to teach them Torah and to marry them and teach them trade. And some say also to teach them to swim. And the Gemara says, okay, but we know that there are some obligations that parents have that are not listed here, that if the parents are failing in that obligation, the community has to step in, like to feed their children and to clothe and house them, right? In those cases, those obligations are not only on the parents, but on the community as a whole. And if the parents are unable or failing to care for their kids, the community has to step in and also care for them. So the question is circumcision a part of the obligations that only the parents are obligated in, or that specifically the parents are obligated in? Or is it a whole communal obligation? And they come down on the side of it's a whole communal obligation. And that's because we have multiple verses that talk about this mitzvah. And so the different verses in the Torah are all understood as teaching different aspects of this mitzvah. One aspect is that the parents are obligated. One aspect is that the community is obligated, because it's a general mitzvah that everybody has to be circumcised, all men. And then ultimately it falls on you yourself to be circumcised if you are not. Mishka.
It interests me that it talks about the community being responsible if nobody else is, because basically the whole idea is to keep the community intact. And to send somebody out of the community would damage the community. So if the parents don't circumcise their son, and despite being ordered to by the court, then it becomes the responsibility of the entire community to make sure this child, this male, stays as part of the community.
Right. And so in other words, it takes a village to raise a kid. Mm-hmm. And in this case, right, sometimes the village also has to take care of this important responsibility of circumcising. Now, in our own current circumstances, we don't do this. We do not confiscate children and circumcise them if their parents refuse to do it. But in cases where parents, for example, have an ideological opposition to this surgery, I do tell parents that it will then become the responsibility of the child to do that for themselves. Mm-hmm. And then that is up to the child as the child grows. And when the child turns 13, the child is responsible for their own mitzvot. That is when, according to Jewish law, that child becomes their responsibility. All right.
May I say something? When our first Russians arrived with young families, there were 2 families that had sons, and they had not been circumcised. So they were the first ones that were assigned to our congregation just about in 1977 or so. And Dr. Pletman, Rabbi Zimmelman, Dr. Pletman arranged for them to be circumcised at Ellis Hospital. And it was it's something that was in the Jewish world that they had been, these boys had, because they had not been able to have it done in Russia, they had it done here in Schenectady.
Yeah. We're not going to spend a ton of time on that aspect of it, but there's been throughout history a regular opposition to circumcision, and one of the symbols of Jewish perseverance in spite of anti-Semitic persecution has been the commitment of the Jewish people to continue to circumcise their children in the face of legal obstacles to do such. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I do think that's part of the history of this. All right, Rambam says, the patriarch Abraham was not called perfect until he had circumcised himself. As it is said in Genesis 17, Hitalech lefanai v'yeh tamim, walk thou before me and be thou perfect, and I will make my covenant between me and thee. So God says, Heyeh tamim, be perfect. Yeah. It's interesting, the Greek view, sort of a secular view, is that the human body comes out perfect, that the human body is perfect in its form, the male body in particular. The Jewish view is that the male body comes into the world in a state of imperfection, and that we do the act of perfecting it. Just as God wants to partner with us in our work to create a more perfect world, that is, to do the acts of tikkun olam, of creating a better place, and that is partnering with God in the act of creation, so too we apply that same idea to the male body, and the body comes into the world imperfect, and we do an act of tikkun, an act of perfecting it. And that's the Rambam's idea here. I find that idea very meaningful. That works for me as a way of understanding Brit Milah. It doesn't work for everybody, but it does work for me. I like that idea of participating with God in creating a more perfect world and a more sanctified body, a more perfect body, and that this is, the way that we're supposed to be is with this covenant, with this sign of circumcision, but we have to do it ourselves. Oh, and Abraham is only called tamim, only called perfect, after he's performed this, or when he's receiving the idea of becoming circumcised. So we continue with the Rambam. In connection with all of the precepts of the Torah, 3 covenants were made with Israel, as it is said, these are the words which the covenant which the Lord commanded, beside the covenant which he made with them in the Chorev. And in the next section it said, ye are standing all this day, all of you, before the Lord your God, that thou should enter into the covenant of the Lord thy God. So there are 3 times the word brit is mentioned in that passage at the end of Deuteronomy, which describes the covenant. So that's the covenant of relationship between God and the people of Israel that contains all the laws of the Torah. That is to say, it's the Torah covenant, or you might call it the Deuteronomic covenant. But in connection with circumcision, Rambam reminds us, 13 covenants were made with our ancestor Abraham, and then he lists all of the different times that it says the word covenant in this passage. And so just that the word brit, and we saw it ourselves when we were reading through the passage, the word brit happens over and over and over. And Rambam says, well, look, when it came to time to look at the whole Torah, brit only occurred, that word only occurred 3 times. But when it comes to this mitzvah has brit 13 times. So it's a very, very significant covenant. All right, so that's the Rambam. So now we've looked at the biblical verses, a Talmudic text, and a medieval text. And now we'll also look, the Birkat HaMazon is also a very ancient text. The tradition says that Birkat HaMazon was written in the days of Joshua. Certainly by the time it is contained in the Talmud, it is already ancient. That is, people have been doing it for a long time by the time that it is contained in the Talmud. And at least the first paragraph is from the time of Joshua. This paragraph might be a little bit later, according to tradition. Well, this is the second paragraph of Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals, which every time you eat bread, you say, and it says right in it that one of the things that we have gratitude for to God is the Al Britcha Shechatamta Bivsarenu, the covenant which thou hast sealed in our flesh. That is referring, of course, to the covenant of circumcision, the covenant of relationship between us and God that is literally sealed in the flesh of male Jews. All right. By the way, some modern folks have wondered whether it's appropriate to say this now that we feel egalitarian, and does it exclude women? There are 2 possible ways to go with that. One is to change this line in Birkat HaMazon to Shechatamta Bilibeinu, that is the covenant which you have sealed in our hearts, which turns it into a metaphor, but it applies to everybody. And the other is the more traditional approach, which is it is in our flesh collectively as the Jewish people, and the women participate in this mitzvah by making sure to circumcise their sons and brothers, husbands, etc. That it's not that women are not participating in the mitzvah of milah. Of course they are. We, women absolutely participate in this mitzvah. It's just not in their flesh specifically. So you will see in some modern ventures the opportunity to replace the word bivsarenu with Billy Benu. Okay. Now I want to talk about Brit more broadly. And this idea, the following several slides come from the teachings of Jonathan Sacks. Sorry, I couldn't see the words and also see you guys. So if you want to interrupt, you're going to have to say something because I turned off my ability to see you so that I can also be reading the words. So the three covenants, the first covenant, which is described in Genesis chapter 9, was with Noah, and through him with all of humanity. And this is the covenant, the Brit of human solidarity, so called by Rabbi Sacks. According to the sages, the Brit of human solidarity contains 7 laws. Those are the Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach, the most famous of which is the sanctity of human life. He who sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God did God make man. Shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishafech. It's a really beautiful phrase, in part because the word Adam which means human being, has the word dam, blood, in it. So Shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishafech it's a very poetic verse. All right, so that's the covenant of human solidarity. The second covenant is our covenant, the covenant of circumcision, which we've already discussed a lot. That's a covenant of Abraham with his descendants. And the third covenant was the covenant with the Israelites in the days of Moses, when the people stood in Mount Sinai and heard the 10 Commandments and accepted the terms of their destiny to be Mamlachet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And in each of these 3 cases, God was the initiator of these covenants. God reached out to Noah, God reached out to Abraham, God reached out to Moses and the people. God is initiating the covenant. So we also can see, teaches Rabbi Sacks, a progression of expectations. What did God expect of Noah? Nothing in particular, save from knowing that there were these laws and following them, right? Noah was passive in terms of ratifying the covenant, in terms of agreeing to it. What did God expect of Abraham? God expects Abraham to ratify the covenant by performing circumcision. So that's a huge initiation ceremony. That's very demanding. But it's also very personal. It's on Abraham's own body. When the Israelites at Sinai, God asked for so much more with regard to engaging with the covenant, not just the 7 commands of Noah or the 8th command for Abraham of circumcision, but 613 mitzvot. There's an idea that the Israelites are supposed to incorporate God consciousness, being in relationship with God, into every aspect of their lives. So you can see that as the covenants proceed, God asks for more and more of God's partners. God entrusts the people with even greater responsibility. So Something else teaches Rabbi Sachs, something else happened at Sinai that had not happened before. God tells Moses to announce the nature of the covenant before making it, to see whether the people agree. And the people agree no less than 3 times. The people say, then the people answered as one, saying, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. The people responded with a single voice, we will do everything that the Lord has spoken. And the people said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and he. So at Sinai, covenant making becomes mutual. Both sides had to agree to the covenant. So that's definitely not the case with regard to the covenant of all humanity with Noah. And it's also not, at the time of Abraham, the case with regard to the covenant of circumcision. Abraham just has to do it. But with regard to our relationship with God through the sanctity of the Torah, that is a covenant which requires human input. And what we have to learn from this is that it's on us to continually renew our covenant. It's on us to continually choose to be in relationship with God and to be focused on this relationship, on that sense of covenant. And that is so powerfully shown by Moses in Parashat Nitzavim, when Moses renews the covenant all on his own without God telling him to. And so that's the first time in the Torah, in Tanakh, where human beings initiate the covenant with God. And Moses says, all of you are standing today before the Lord your God, your leaders, your tribes, your elders and officials, all the men of Israel, all of your children, all of your wives, all the strangers in the camp, from the woodcutter to the water jar, to enter into the covenant of the Lord your God and its oath, which the Lord your God is making with you today, to establish you today as God's people, that God may be your God, as God promised you and swore to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's a renewal of the covenant. Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem lifnei Adonai Elohechem. And this is, by the way, a passage which we always read on the Shabbat before Rosh Hashanah. And the idea here is we are required to renew our covenant with God, just as Moses renewed our covenant. Unlike the 3 times where God makes covenants with human beings, this is our human desire to make a covenant with God. And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs points out that it isn't the last time that the covenant was renewed. The covenant was renewed again in Joshua's lifetime, and then in Yehoiada's lifetime, and in Chizkiyahu's lifetime, and in Yoshiyahu's lifetime, and in Ezra and Nehemiah's lifetime. And so too in our day, each generation has to also renew the covenant for themselves. And so this is sort of my big idea about covenant. It is our birth or adoption ceremonies, our conversion ceremonies, and even our B'nai Mitzvah celebrations are all opportunities to renew or to recommit to the covenant, to the Brit, to our relationship with Judaism, to our relationship with God, and ultimately it's the possibility of a redeemed world, of a world that is more perfect, a world that has undergone some tikkun olam. So I just want to pause there because this is the big idea. The central takeaway of this session is these rituals, which we're now going to talk about in detail. These rituals are all about sanctifying our commitment to this covenant.
I'm waiting to hear about all these ceremonies to do that.
All right.
Some of it's pretty obvious, but how many opportunities and how serious they are.
So we can jump right in. The let's talk about the components of our covenant ceremonies. And here I mean specifically the welcoming a child covenant ceremony. And this, what I've done here over the next few slides is I've broken down the covenant ceremony into its component parts, and we're going to look at examples of each part, at each of those component parts, and what they're doing in the ritual and how they're connected to the broader idea. So traditionally, Jewish male children are entered into the Jewish people and the covenantal relationship with God, Torah, and Israel on the 8th day of their lives, barring any health complications, by means of the ritual removal of the foreskin of their penis. Jews have been performing this ritual for more than 2,000 years, even in the face of much opposition, to inscribe the covenant into the very flesh. Historically, Jewish female children were named, they were given names, but they were not ritually entered into the covenant. Right? That's true. Historically, the covenant was really a covenant of men, and if you said that there's the Jewish people were the male Jewish people with their wives. Right? We don't think about Jewish peoplehood that way anymore. We are much more egalitarian. Jewish peoplehood includes both men and women. But to this day, for many in the Jewish world, especially in the Orthodox Jewish world, but even in many conservative synagogues, the naming of a female child involves simply one or both of the parents being honored with an aliyah and saying the blessings over the Torah, and then the rabbi offers a Misha Beirach, during which the rabbi names the child. Well, that is very traditional, and many female children have been named in that way, possibly some of your children or you yourselves. Around 40 years ago, maybe 45 years ago, around in the early 70s, the mid 70s, that's the late 70s, and sometime in the 70s, parents felt that they should also have a party to celebrate the namings of their daughters. And that's when it became customary to have simchat bat, or a zevet bat ceremony. Those ceremonies are beautiful. They are meaningful. They have all kinds of innovations ritually, but they are largely focused not on covenant, but on naming. They can occur at any time, and often do occur at 1 month or 6 months or a year of age, or whenever it's convenient for the family. Only very recently are rabbis and parents conceptualizing the celebration for a newborn daughter as an opportunity to ritually welcome female children also into the covenant of the Jewish people. So specifically to do a brit ceremony for daughters, that is a very new, only in the last 10 or 15 years sort of thing. Not even, I mean, I still go to ceremonies where covenant is barely mentioned. Usually it's mentioned a little bit, but by me, like the covenant should be the central part of the ritual, and the naming is not the central part. So to do this in a traditional way, to be able to adopt a covenant ceremony for children who are not being circumcised on the 8th day, you have to break down what the components are. So there are 10 components. Here are the first 5. Bris, or covenant ceremonies, have a mandatory timing. They should happen on the 8th day. Okay. Now, sometimes happens that a male child can't be circumcised on the 8th day because of the health of the child or because of the health of the mother. Sometimes it happens that a male child is circumcised at a different time. but there should still be a covenant ceremony on the 8th day. And female children can be named at any time, but Jewish babies should be welcomed into the covenant of the Jewish people on the 8th day. That is when Isaac was entered into the covenant, and that is the traditional day for entering into the covenant. And I will say, right, the 8th day is not convenient, but I think it's supposed to not be convenient. It's supposed to be a day that is spiritual, not easy. And it's the day, the 8th day has significance because it's the day after 1 week. You know, 7 is a holy number, not just holy H-O-L-Y, but holy W-H-O-L-E-Y. That is, it is a number that describes a whole, a completion. And 8 is that which goes beyond complete. It's sort of the day of more perfect, the day of possible redemption. And so there's something about the 8th day that is specifically powerful. So that's the first step. The first step is that it should happen on the 8th day. So then the next step is that the baby is welcomed into the community. And the baby is welcomed into the community with the words Baruch haba, or Brucha haba'ah. Blessed is the one who comes. Welcome. That is a part of the traditional bris, and it is a part of a covenant ceremony for any child. Then there's an invocation of the prophet Elijah, usually an invocation by motioning to the chair of the prophet, right? A specific chair set aside to represent the prophet Elijah. Prophet Elijah comes to every covenant ceremony. Why? For the same reason that the prophet Elijah comes to every Havdalah ceremony and to every Seder, because there is potential redemption. And Elijah is the symbol of potential redemption. So sometimes the prophet Miriam is also invoked in the way that sort of Elijah is represented in the Seder with wine, and Miriam is represented in the Seder with water. Miriam is deeply associated with water. Elijah is the prophet of end time redemption. That is the end of days, the Messianic era, the fact that the world could be complete, perfect. Miriam is the prophet of small redemptions, of the day-to-day miracles, of the sustenance of life. The ongoing blessing of life is what I wrote here. So I think invoking Miriam and having maybe a chair for Miriam is also a really important part of covenant ceremonies. So the fourth thing is reading certain verses from the Torah, which relate to Brit, to covenant. The fifth is the sign of the covenant itself, accompanied by blessing the mitzvah of doing that mitzvah. Asher kichanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu limol, right? Thanking God for sanctifying us with the mitzvot and commanding us to circumcise our children, v'tzivanu al hamilah, right? And the mitzvah, of course, as I said before, the mitzvah of circumcision is incumbent upon the parents. So if somebody else is going to do it, the parents have to appoint that person as their shaliach, as their emissary. A good mohel or mohelet always asks, do you appoint me as your emissary to perform this mitzvah? And I have been to some britot where the mohel or mohelet sets everything up, and then one of the parents does the slicing themselves. I myself wanted to do that, but decided at the last minute not to my wife's great relief. And so the mitzvah of Mila is on the parents. So that's the fifth one. The sixth is a blessing over the wine and the covenant. So the wine sanctified, just like when we do Kiddush on Shabbat, we do Borei Pri Hagafen and then Mekadesh Shabbat, and then we do the paragraph that sanctifies the day. So too, at a wedding, we say Borei Pri Hagafen, and then we do the paragraph which sanctifies the wedding. So too, at a bris, we do Borei Pri Hagafen, and then the blessing which sanctifies the covenant. And so that blessing is also said. Then in the seventh one, the baby is given a name. Often names are connected to deceased family members, which links the child to Jewish history and community. That's especially the case for Hebrew names, but also sometimes for English names. Then there's the priestly blessing, and there's an opportunity to bless the parents. Also, sometimes the parent who has given birth might say the Gomel blessing, thanking God for having successfully completed that task. Surgery sometimes, experience, labor, and so that is thanking God for life. And then also the 10th is bris is a festive occasion with a festive meal, just like a wedding has a festive meal. The meal is a sudat mitzvah, a meal celebrating a mitzvah, acknowledging the sanctity and the joy of the event. All right, any questions about these 10 steps?
I'm just struck by the fact that there's no Shehechianu as part of these.
Oh yes, no Shehechianu in Brit.
Why not?
Well, because traditionally Shehechianu isn't, Shehechianu is about wearing new clothes. Shehechianu is about having new experiences.
Well, if you're a new parent.
Yeah, right. I mean, I wouldn't say it would be terribly wrong to say Shehechianu, but it isn't part of the traditional liturgy.
I'm just surprised. Is the priestly blessing is for the child?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, the priestly blessing is for the child.
And that could be done by parents or an officiant of some.
That's right. It can be done by the parents, by the rabbi, by grandparents who are present. But it's for the child, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or thoughts? So of these 10 steps, which ones are gendered?
Circumcision.
Right.
Period.
So that's it, right? There are 10 aspects of this covenant ceremony, and only one of them only applies to male children. The fifth one. All of the rest of them, I believe, should be applied equally to children of any gender. And so it says in my next slide. The step in the slides above, which must be differentiated based on gender, is 5. That's it, one step. For children who are not being circumcised on the 8th day, I recommend using another concrete ritual of covenant. And I wrote it that way for a reason, children who are not being circumcised on the 8th day, because sometimes there are boys who are not being circumcised on the 8th day for whatever reason, but they should still have a covenant ceremony on the 8th day. And say they've already been circumcised in the hospital on the 2nd day, but on the 8th day, they should be entered into the covenant of Abraham and Sarah, and that covenant, that being entered into that covenant, should have a ritual. So for number 5, there are several different ritual options. So the one that Rachel and I did for Ellie was we wrapped her in a talit. Actually, we had her 4 grandparents each take a corner of the talit, and they did the act of wrapping. And wrapping Ellie in a talit was very natural in the context of a baby, because babies are often wrapped or swaddled in a baby blanket. The talit symbolizes protection and God's embrace, as well as connection to Torah and to mitzvot. And the blessings that we and her grandparents gave her as part of that talit ritual deepened the significance and the power of that moment. I really like the ritual of the talit wrapping. It is beautiful, beautiful ritual. And it's one concrete option that you can do to replace the concrete option of surgery on the penis if that surgery is not happening at that moment. So another possibility is candle lighting. So the lighting of a ner neshama, or a soul candle, can mark the entry of a child into the covenant. Candle represents the new light that has entered the world with the birth of a new soul. And candlelight is connected to the idea of divine presence. It's a reminder that the occasion is holy and distinct. And so lighting candles can also be a concrete metaphor for covenant. Another option is to touch the child to the Torah scroll. So that is an option which certainly is easily integrated into a Shabbat morning service. If you're going to be hosting a Kiddush luncheon after Shul on Shabbat, and you always thought, oh yeah, it's just we have an aliyah and the rabbi gives the kid a name, and then the rabbi says to you, well, actually, I want to do a whole covenant ceremony, right? I want to focus more on covenant, and I think it should be on the 8th day, and all of this sort of stuff. And it's very easy to integrate the touching the child to the Torah scroll into as a symbol of covenant into the older idea of just coming up for an aliyah on Shabbat. Mishka.
I was at Romemu in the city some years ago, and there was this ceremony. The little girl, and I don't know what age, but certainly was swaddled in the talit and then sat down on the open Torah, on the lectern, and her hand was then put behind her so that she would then be touching the Torah with her hand. And it was just, and they had almost everybody from who was sitting down in the congregation up on the bima, and everyone helped offer the priestly blessing. It was tears all over the place.
Right.
It was really
beautiful. Right. Again, that is I have seen that done very successfully and beautifully.
Yeah.
Another option is foot washing, and that washing of the feet is just like Abraham was the one who was the first one to circumcise. So Abraham is also associated with washing the feet of the guests, of having that sense of hospitality and welcoming. And so how do you welcome a child into the covenant? You might welcome a child in the way that Abraham welcomed guests into his home by doing this ritual of feet washing. I do offer this to parents. I also usually say to them, I feel a little weird about it because it feels a little bit too much like baptism to me. And usually parents do not pick this option. But I do offer it as an option. I've seen it done once, and it did feel a little weird to me.
Well, you've got the water and Miriam connection.
That's right. Yes, there's a water and Miriam connection. There's a water and Abraham connection. I don't think it's from a sort of metaphorical or spiritual perspective. I think it's a really beautiful idea. And also this idea of hachnasat orchim, of welcoming, right? We say brucha haba or baruch haba, welcome. That's the first words of a covenant ceremony. And this is exactly about that, about welcoming a child in. And so I think it's really beautiful. My only hesitation about it is its similarity to a ritual of baptism that looks like another faith tradition, and there is, I'm not sure that I can really necessarily get over that. I would do this if a couple wanted to, because I do offer it as an option. All right, and so now we're going to look at a sample as a sample option, and this option is one that I wrote for a congregant's grandchild, and it is a candle lighting ceremony. So you get to see the candle lighting version. So we started with some exposition, some explanation of what we were doing, and we had all of the child's aunts and uncles read this passage. So this was done on Zoom about a year and some months ago, a year ago. It was right at the beginning of COVID, maybe last April or May. And everybody was all over the country, and we had a bunch of different talking boxes, and this way everybody could be participating, even participating with some actual text, and they read these different aspects. So I connected this idea of candle lighting to 5 different ideas, or 6 different ideas. 6 different attributes of God: presence, holiness, joy, growth, memory, and soul. So, and life, right? So in the end, may our daughter fulfill the brit, the covenant of the Jewish people, through actions and mitzvot which bring light, life, and love into the world, honoring the attributes of presence, holiness, joy, growth, memory, and soul. And for each of these, I have a verse or a concept in Judaism that connects candlelight to that idea. And I've even included some verses, like the verse from Esther, La Yudim Haita Ora V'Simcha V'Sason V'Ikar, and the verse from Proverbs, Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam, Nishmat Elohim. Yeah, that's Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam. The life breath of man is the lamp of the Lord, right? So each of these aspects are connected, deeply embedded in Judaism. So then we began by welcoming the baby into the world. We sang the song that's adapted from Genesis 48, from Jacob talking about his children, his grandchildren, actually. This is part of the scene where Joseph brings his children, Ephraim and Manasseh, to his ailing grandfather. I mean, his father, their grandfather, and he crosses the arms, and he invokes God's emissary, the angel, who protects, who redeems himself, Jacob. Can you also protect all of my children and my grandchildren, and let them be called by my name? And so this is a very common song to sing at covenant ceremonies. We also sang it at Jonah's. Many of you were at Jonah's covenant ceremony. We began with singing Hamalach. And then we welcome the child in, Brucha Haba'ah, and we, on Zoom, we brought her into the camera angle. If you were doing this in a synagogue, you would walk in with her at that point. And you can honor different members of your family with the different honors of carrying the child in. Then the next section is welcoming the baby into the covenant. And I mentioned the importance of verses. So here I have given two verses. One from, we've actually looked at both of these sections earlier in our class. We looked at Genesis chapter 7, chapter 17. That's the moment where Abraham is given the covenant of circumcision. And God says, I will maintain my covenant between me and you and your offspring to come as an everlasting covenant throughout the ages. So that's very deep idea of covenant. And then also the covenant that Moses renews in Parshat Nitzavim, Atem Nitzavim Hayom Kulchem. This we talked about at the end of the passage of the Rabbi Jonathan Sachs meditation on covenant, that that Moses is renewing the covenant, and Moses says, I'm not cutting this covenant, I'm not making this brit just with the people who are standing here, but with all generations, all future generations who are going to come. Everybody who is ever going to be a Jew is included in the covenant. Gary, did you have something you wanted to say? No, you were just moving. Great. So the verses are a part of welcoming into the covenant. Then we invoked the chair of Elijah. There's a whole paragraph to do in Hebrew, but I translated it into English. So I only gave the first line of that paragraph in Hebrew, and then I translated it into English. And then everybody participates in this line, may be filled and satisfied with the goodness of your house and the holiness of your sacred home. In other words, like, what is the redemption that we're looking for? We're looking for a redeemed world where God dwells among us. And that's connected to this idea of covenant, of redemption. And every child brings the possibility for a more redeemed world. Okay, and then the mitzvah blessing of welcoming the child into the covenant. Asher kichana b'mitzvotav etzivanu lahachnisa bivritam shel Avraham Avinu v'Sara imenu. Our sacred duty to enter our daughter into the covenant of Abraham and Sarah. And then everybody says, Amen. Just as she has entered into the covenant, so may she be entered into a life of Torah, love, and good deeds. Then we did the candle lighting ceremony, and this is the moment where, right, up to this, that was all very similar to what it would look like if it was a Brit Milah, a covenant of circumcision also. Then at this moment where the circumcision would go, we instead do the candle lighting. So how we did it with this particular situation, because we had the grandparents each on a separate screen and the parents on a separate screen. So the grandparents lit their candle. Each of the grandparents lit one candle and they held them up. And then when the parents lit their candles, the grandparents held their candles up as if they were passing the light down. If we were doing this in person, I would have the grandparents literally walk over and light the candle of the parents of their child, so that the light of the candles would be passing down. And so these are the blessings that they offered. These blessings are the same as the blessings that I have also used, or that we used for Ellie. They're very similar to the blessings that we used for Ellie in wrapping her in the talit. So each corner got a different blessing, and they're very similar to these blessings. Bless our granddaughter and give her long life and wisdom, good life, health, fulfillment, and joy. May she be at peace. Also, we had our parents say these blessings at Jonah's covenant ceremony also. And then I added in a couple more blessings that connect again to the idea of light. Torah or, yeah, okay, all good stuff. Then the parents kindle their child's candle, which is in a candlestick or a holder, and they said this blessing, which is all about light and the connection of light to covenant and the connection of light to Torah and to God. And then I said, the rabbi said, as this little child's candle has been kindled, symbolic of joy, holiness, and Torah, so may her soul's light be kindled. May Torah mitzvot touch her life, filling her mind with wisdom and her heart with understanding. And I blessed the parents. May these parents who have brought her into the world always strive to bring her close to the ways of God and our people. May they teach her Torah every day through their words and their deeds. May they be privileged to raise their child to adulthood. And may she enjoy the blessings of learning, sharing love, and good deeds. And let us say Amen. Then we moved on to the naming. So if we go back to our steps, right? So the candle lighting ceremony was the sign of the covenant. We did the blessing of over the wine and the blessing over the covenant. Actually, maybe we hadn't gotten to that yet, or maybe I forgot to put it in the page. Oh no, we hadn't gotten to. We did it as part of the naming ceremony. So the blessing over the covenant can either be connected to the number 5 or connected to number 7. So, and you can do it different ways. The reason why we did it this way is because they had two ants, I think, and we wanted to honor the ants with the chairs. So at this point, I added in the chair for Miriam. Remember, we had mentioned that you can have the chair for Elijah and the chair for Miriam. So in this section of naming the child, then I said, Zeh hakisei shel Miriam haneviyah. This is the chair of Miriam the prophetess, remembered for blessing. Calling on the prophetess of strength and song, we hope that this child's song will join with the world's song and that her dance will bring joy and healing to the world. And again, there's a deep idea here of Miriam is a part of the sort of day-to-day redemptions. So then we did Borei Pri Hagafen over wine and the blessing of the covenant, which is Baruch Ata Hashem Koreit Habrit. Blessed are you, God, guiding power of the universe, who sanctified the beloved one from the womb and embedded the law in our bodies and sealed us with the sign of the Holy Covenant. By this merit, God of life, our portion, our rock, ensure the beloved of our posterity be saved from the abyss for the sake of the covenant which God has placed within us. Blessed are you, God, who establishes the covenant. And that's the exact same as the prayer that we do at a Brit Milah. But here it refers to this covenant of the candles that we did, right? The broader covenant, the idea of our relationship with God, our relationship with the Jewish people. Then the prayer of giving her a name, V'karei Shema B'Yisrael, she shall be called, and then her name. I believe this child's name was Mia Hollander. And then everybody says, Hodu Ladonai Ki Tov, Ki L'olam Chasto, and a blessing that she shall grow up to be, to grow up to adulthood. And then the parents bless the child with the priestly blessing. And then I blessed the parents with this blessing of becoming parents and having the holy responsibility of parenthood, and sort of a prayer of differentiation. I got this prayer from Ritual Well. I liked it, and it's a prayer about the importance of maintaining some boundaries, some self in your relationship with your child, which I think is always good advice to give to new parents, because it's easy to forget. We're very easy at blaming our own parents for not having good boundaries, but then we don't always have the best boundaries ourselves, you know? All right, so that's the end of covenant ceremonies. Does anyone have any thoughts, comments, reactions? Did you learn anything? Was anything new?
What do you do with the candles at the end? You let them burn down, or you
I
put them out, or what?
Yeah, I suggested letting the candle that symbolized the child's light. Yeah. I suggested letting that one burn all the way down, and blowing the other ones out. Mm-hmm. That's what I suggested. But obviously you could do it any way you wanted. You could, if you were doing this in person in a synagogue, and right after you did this, you were having this festive meal, you know, with everybody, like you could just leave them on the sideboard and let them burn for the whole meal. Like, I think that would be really nice.
Yeah, my concern would be blowing the candles out wouldn't feel right.
Yeah, I totally hear that. I mean, right. Yeah, what I recommended was keeping the child's candle lit, but everybody else could blow out theirs. After all, most of the other candles were all in other rooms. I mean, they weren't in the room with the child anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
I really like the whole of it. I like the way it flows, but I would want there to be an opportunity for the parents to not just bless the child with a priestly blessing, but have something very personal about their feelings.
Yeah, I didn't put that in because it was in italics, and I didn't put all of the italics in. But yeah, as soon as the naming is over, the parents get to explain the names, and that's very personal and beautiful.
Right. I like that you guys did that.
Yeah. So that is always a part of it, and that is usually the tear-jerking moment. I mean, certainly it was hard for me to even get through what I prepared to say for Jonah.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts or comments?
This is kind of from left field, but this is a ceremony that the grandparents put together for a child. But you know, now we have the realization that the gender assigned at birth is not always the gender that the child feels comfortable in.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if we will be seeing the evolution of a new ceremony that welcomes the person into the gender they feel comfortable in.
Absolutely. The gender reassignment and ceremonies of welcoming children into new gender are definitely being written and are a part of it. And I have, so this ceremony is a ceremony for a child on the 8th day who is not being circumcised on the 8th day, or who is not being circumcised in public on the 8th day. There have been families who have chosen to have a private circumcision with the mohel without all the blessings, but on the 8th day, according to tradition, but to not celebrate that piece of it, but instead to do this kind of a ceremony on, later in that day, to because they feel more comfortable with this kind of an approach. So again, like this, once you understand the components of a covenant ceremony, you can choose how to build a covenant ceremony using those components. And I recognize that Milah, circumcision, doesn't work for everybody as a celebration, as a public event. Some people choose to do it in the hospital, some people don't. I personally really like it. I think it is very beautiful. And I like the Rambam's idea that we discussed earlier about becoming more perfect, about helping to be in that process of perfecting the world. And I also, one of the things that makes me really uncomfortable about it is the way in which it is not an equivalent ceremony for men and women, for boys and girls. And who are we to know whether these children are going to want to be boys or girls? And why are we enforcing a particular kind of being on them, at birth? And so I have colleagues who have chosen to raise their children without gender and to let the children choose for themselves. And those colleagues, they did not announce. They said they were having an 8th day ceremony. They did not say whether it was for a boy or a girl. They had a child with a penis. They did the circumcision privately, and then they did a ceremony very similar to this one that was in public, and in no way throughout the whole thing could you tell what the gender of the child was. Mm-hmm. And so this ceremony leans into the fact that it's a daughter. It the parents here were perfectly comfortable with that language, but it would be very easy to replace child in each case and to be as gender neutral as you would like to be about this. So I do think that's possible. It's a little crunchy hippie to raise your child without gender altogether. I mean, I know some people who are doing that, but it's one thing to be like, we're assigning this child a gender at birth, but we're going to be very welcoming if the child chooses to change their gender. And it's another thing to say we're going to raise our child without gender altogether. Also, it's extremely difficult to buy clothes for children that are not gendered. I mean, everything is gendered, even toys, even books, and don't get me started on the fact that the girl clothes say things like beautiful, cute, daddy's princess, and the boy clothes say stuff like explore, discover.
Rabbi?
That drives me up a wall.
It's kind of like trying to buy something that wasn't made in China. See,
right.
See how long you can how long can you do that?
Yeah. And you just end up with gray clothes if you try to only look for the gender neutral clothing, or you end up putting your girl children in boy clothes, which, I mean, that isn't bad, but yeah. Anyway, I can't say that would be easy. And I do have a 3.5-year-old and a almost 6-month-old. So yes, Anita, I expect that the rituals of transition will not, that as they are created and as they come to pass, will likely not be welcome to the covenant rituals, because those are really designed for babies or for converts or for adoption. They're not really designed, but I imagine that rituals of transition will include things like immersion in the mikvah, will include some aspects that are contained here. You know, you are being born into a new gender or whatever. We're acknowledging your new identity. I definitely think that there are overlaps. Yeah, Mishka.
A question: how you chose Shifra, Pua, Hannah, and Yocheved as the ancestors to mention in this particular place?
Right, I got this one from Ritual Well, so I kept it whole stock what they had, but I can answer that. Right, Shifra and Pua, Hannah and Yocheved are all involved in bringing children into the world.
Right.
So Shifra and Pua as midwives, Hannah as a mother, and Yocheved. Yocheved is traditionally also associated. I mean, she's the nursemaid for her own son, Moses. Since Miriam already has been invoked.
That's where I thought she was missing in that.
I do think that also Miriam isn't associated with motherhood. She's associated with connection, but she isn't associated with motherhood. We don't have anywhere listed Miriam's children or that Miriam gave birth. Right. I think the idea here was Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah are not paragons of great motherhood. I mean, Rachel and Leah spend most of their time as mothers fighting with each other about who has more babies. Rivka preferences Jacob over Esau. Sarah is so frustrated about being barren that she adopts a child and then casts him and his surrogate mother out. I mean, these are not, they're not great moms. So I think that's part of the idea here too.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. All right. So we're moving on to conversion, and which is also about covenant. So conversion has biblical beginnings from the book of Ruth. Do not urge me to leave you, Ruth says. Wherever you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. This is understood by the rabbis as the first person who converts to Judaism. The word for convert in the rabbinic tradition is ger. Ger, from the word lagur, means to dwell or reside. The ger is the stranger who resides among you. The ger is the person who is no longer a stranger. Nowadays, we call converts to Judaism Jews by choice. And in some sense, in the 21st century in America, we're all Jews by choice because we could easily choose not to be involved in Judaism. And we are choosing and continue to choose every day to be invested in our Jewish identity. In other words, invested in our sense of covenant. And I think that Jews by choice is a really great way and model for understanding what conversion is and how we can all see ourselves as part of that process. So what are the halachic requirements for conversion? Immersion in a mikvah, circumcision or hatafat brit, that has to happen before the immersion, and learning about Jewish law / the acceptance of the yoke of the commandments. That also has to happen before the immersion. So the immersion is the last thing in the process. And so that's cool. Here's a picture of a mikvah. You have to completely immerse. There has to be some witness of your immersion. There's a blessing, al tfilat gerim. And that's a beautiful blessing. So that's that. Oh, Shechianu can be said also at that.
How cold is the water?
It's not cold. I mean, there are mikvot that are cold. The mikvah of the Holy Ari in Israel, in Tzfat, which was the first mikvah I ever immersed in, is a natural spring water mikvah. It is cold. And I assumed that all mikvaot were like that. But no, if you go to the mikvah in Albany, it's like 80 degrees, the water. It's very comfortable. It's like a bathtub.
Yeah.
I went last week to the mikvah in Albany, not to immerse, but to get a tour, because I'm doing some conversions on Sunday. I'm doing 4 conversions on Sunday. So I wanted to make sure that it wasn't that going with these families for the conversions wasn't my first time at the mikvah, so I went. Now mikvah is very warm. It's comfortable.
Does the water is always spring water, or is it also allowed to be heated?
So the mikvah, what makes the mikvah kosher is that there is a cistern that is undrawn water. That's called a bore. And the water that is naturally pouring in there is natural occurring water. It is not warmed. And next to that cistern is like basically a bathtub with steps to go down into it. And there's a plug that connects the 2 bodies of water. And before the immersion happens, you remove the plug so that the waters mix. And that is called the hashakah, the kiss. And when those waters kiss, then the whole thing, including the bathtub drawn water part, is understood to be living waters, is a kosher mikvah.
Oh, okay.
So that's how it works.
I didn't know that. Thank you.
Yeah. So you're allowed to immerse in drawn water if it has done the hashakah, the kiss, with the not drawn water, and that's how most modern mikvot are built. There are different kinds of setups for these cisterns. Some cisterns are sort of naturally replenishing, and some cisterns, the idea is that they're like a sealed box, and they never run out. And sometimes the cisterns are next to the pool, and sometimes the cistern is underneath the pool. So the Chabad style is called bor mitachat bor, something like that. The mikveh is above, and the cistern is below, and the hashakah happens vertically. That is not the customary Ashkenazi practice. So if you ever go to a Chabad mikveh, because that's not usually the way that that mainstream Jewish folks understand mikveh is supposed to be. But would I say it's not kosher? No, I think it's still a kosher mikveh.
So who pulls out the plug? When you go in the mikveh, the person going in pulls this plug?
So you can do that. Then it's nice that the person has that opportunity to participate in that part of the mikveh itself. I think with these children that I'm going to be converting on are participating in their conversion on Sunday, I will give each family a tour of the mikveh before we do the immersion, so that they understand the lay of the land. And I will try to do it at a 2-year-old, 4-year-old level, so that the kids understand what's going on. I will pull out the plug as I'm giving the tour, so that I show them how it works, and that will be enough to make the mikveh kosher. The truth is, you can do it. You only need to do that once per day. So, but I will do it 3 times. I will do it for each immersion. You don't have to do it for each immersion. Once it's touched for in that particular day, it's done. It's kosher. So, but it's nice to have each individual get to do it, get to participate in that aspect. So I will do it 3 times for them. All right. There is no standardized requirements for what you have to learn to be allowed to convert. The Talmud says, teach them some of the major mitzvot and some of the minor mitzvot. A convert whose intentions were not checked, nor who was informed about the commandments and their punishment, but was circumcised and immersed in front of a Beit Din, he is a convert. So, in other words, right, ultimately, this person was circumcised, this person immersed, kosher, Jewish. Even if we know that he is converting for an ulterior motive, if he was circumcised and immersed, he is no longer considered a Gentile, although we are suspicious of him until his righteousness becomes apparent. And even if he returns and worships an idol, then he is considered to be a sinning Israelite. You can't unconvert, according to Judaism. So that's the Rambam. The Rambam's, that's a quote from the Rambam, Hilchot Isurei Bia. So, in other words, once you're Jewish, you're Jewish. And just like if you're a Jew and you're worshiping idols, you're a Jew who's sinning. If you're a convert who is worshiping idols, you are understood to be a Jew who is sinning. All right, so that's conversion. And now we'll do 2 minutes on B'nai Mitzvah. B'nai Mitzvah that's the life cycle event that we all attend very regularly in the life of a synagogue, because we do these events publicly on Shabbat morning in the synagogue, as opposed to a Brit Milah, which is often done in the parent's house, like with just friends and family and not the whole community, or weddings, which are invited guests only, at least in this country, and conversions, which are very private. A life cycle event that gets to be, in some ways, the most public is the one where it's awkward 13-year-olds who, I can't say that would have been my favorite age for forcing people to have a very public event, but there you go. So anyone who is converted as a child their conversion ratifies, or their conversion sinks in and becomes solid when they celebrate becoming bar bat mitzvah. If a child converts if the parents convert the child at, say, 2 or 3, and because they've decided to raise their child Jewish, and the child goes to a religious school, and the child then has a bar mitzvah, then that child is Jewish total, like the conversion stuck. If the child is converted at 2 and doesn't do anything Jewish again until college, let's say, and never had a bar mitzvah and never participated in Jewish education, never did anything like that, then the child has to convert again as an adult. it doesn't, like, when we think about converting children, we are making a choice for them that ultimately they have to choose for themselves. But we accept bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah as a child choosing to live into their Jewish identity, to be connected to the covenant. What does it mean to be a child of the commandment, right? Bar mitzvah means son of the commandment. Bat mitzvah, daughter of the commandment. B'nai mitzvah, children of the commandment. What does it mean to be a child of commandment? This is a question that I ask each of our B'nai mitzvah children. And so, I mean, you've probably noticed that most of them relate to it in some way, as in their teaching that they teach on the morning of their simcha. They often will say, becoming bar mitzvah, a child of the commandment, means to me, and then something like that. To me, the biggest thing here is relationship. The fact that we call this ceremony child of the commandment means that we want our children to be in relationship. We want our young people to see themselves in relationship to their Jewish identity, the same kind of relationship that they have with their parents. In other words, we want them to see Judaism as kind of a parent to them, that it guards them, it nurtures them, it teaches them. It's a part of their being guided into adulthood is through Judaism. And to me, that is the biggest piece, the relationship with the Jewish people. And we have a name for that relationship. It's a covenantal relationship, a relationship born of covenant, a pact between us and God, between the Jewish people and God. And so, to me, that's why B'nai Mitzvah is a part of this, of tonight's session, because B'nai Mitzvah is about ratifying the covenant. It's about each one of us having this opportunity to say, yes, I am committed to the covenant. So then, I put in a couple of other points here about how life cycle events are ways of marking growth. And so too, this is a life cycle event which marks the growth of child. And there's an idea of liminal spaces, that is, you're not quite a child and not quite an adult, but you're right in between. And I think 13 is actually a pretty good age for that. By the time, 18 also in our modern society isn't a bad age for that. Still, I think 18-year-olds are still liminal, still on the cusp of things. No question, in our society, that's true. But I do think that for most of history, 18-year-olds were adults in a way that nowadays they are not as much. And even in our society, 18-year-olds can vote, can legally work.
Can be parents themselves very easily.
What?
They can be parents themselves.
Right. Yes. And so I do think that 13 really does speak to this amazing age of possibility, of in between. And then there has been an emphasis in part to help keep kids in religious school through high school, but also with an acknowledgement that 13-year-olds aren't really making their own decisions, to push some of the bar mitzvah things to 16 or 17 juniors or seniors in high school, who can then be asked really really, do you confirm your Jewish identity? Do you?
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I have read elsewhere that whether or not you have a bar mitzvah ceremony, when you become 13, you are bar mitzvah.
That's correct.
Now, that's contrary to what you're saying.
I don't think I said that you don't become bar mitzvah. No, you become bar mitzvah by virtue of being 13. The ceremony that we have on Shabbat morning is a celebration of that becoming.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think you had said something more like if somebody was converted as a small child and then did not lead any type of Jewish life or do anything, that being 13 would not be enough.
Yes,
think.
that is correct.
Yeah.
A child who does not celebrate becoming bar mitzvah through some acknowledgement of their Jewish education and Jewish practice, or a child who goes to religious school and then rejects bar mitzvah, which does happen. There are children who choose not to do it, or families who want to do it, but then the kids are not in the right headspace to do it at that moment, and they just never get around to it, or they do it as adults or whatever, right? Situation like that, if the kids were converts, if the kids were born Jewish, then they're Jewish, even if they didn't, and they are benot mitzvah, even if they didn't celebrate it through, by standing up in front of their whole community and doing something. But if they were converted as youths, it is through that concretization of standing in front of the community and acknowledging their Jewish identity by participating in the service in some way, that seals the deal with respect to their conversion, because we understand that they were converted by their parents and not by themselves. All right.
Just one question. What act, we traditionally for bar mitzvah, it's being called to the Torah and responding, if they're being called to the Torah and they have an aliyah. Is that the essence of it, or is there a possibility of some other means?
There's no set anything in particular, because like Mendel said, it's just becoming 13 is enough. So, a child who is willing to be counted in a minyan and to say the blessings for the Torah, that would be enough that would be enough. You do not have to read a haftarah. You do not have to read from the Torah. You do not have to lead the service. Just to be a part of the community as an adult. Gary.
In the days of the temple, how was a bar mitzvah celebrated?
I don't know the answer to that question. The Talmud describes like checking for pubic hairs, and then only later on did the convention of 13 become, by 13 most children have had at least 2 pubic hairs. So and we don't go around checking. So 13 is our, it's a way of saying, have you begun puberty? And so yes, 13 is the conventional time. Now there are some 13-year-olds who have not yet begun puberty, and some 13-year-olds who have completed puberty altogether. And studies have been shown that puberty has gotten younger, not significantly, but by a few months on average, and maybe even by a year.
In some places, more than 2 or 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. And so anyway, all of this to say, 13 is a good conventional age for that.
So the bar mitzvah is more of a rabbinic practice rather than a temple practice.
I definitely think that's correct. Bar mitzvah doesn't come from the Torah. Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, Ishmael was circumcised at 13, but I do not think that that is the source for bar mitzvah being at 13. I would have to do some research into that. So yes, I think it's more of a rabbinic practice than a biblical one. All right, so that brings us to the end of our study of a Brit, although obviously we will continue to think about it. And next week, we close our Back to the Basics life cycles session with an exploration of the ceremonies around wedding, marriage. We'll do a little bit on Jewish ideas about sex and sexuality. So if you have any questions about that you particularly want me to focus on, send me an email sometime between now and next Thursday so that I can think about them in advance. I will prepare a little bit about that, but what we're going to mainly focus on is the new rituals for gay marriage within the conservative movement, and what those rituals for gay marriage teach us about all marriage, and in what ways are they similar and what ways are they different to the traditional marriage, and why would you choose one option over another option. And as a sort of teaser, the big question in marriage is, what do you do to make it equal with each party, equal parties to the marriage, right? Traditional Jewish marriage does not treat both parties equally. It really treats the man as the actor and the woman as the one being acted upon. And so what can we learn from same-sex marriage about a greater ethos of egalitarianism that we can then take back into heterosexual marriage and into all marriage, and to think about marriage as being more egalitarian, more equal parties. I think that's a very powerful way of looking at it. And plus it's June, so we'll be focusing on gay marriage as a way of honoring Pride Month.
Will you be having some texts for Ketubot that might reflect both traditional heterosexual marriage and gay marriage?
Yes.
Good.
Yes, we will look at Ketubah texts and also the texts of the Sheva Brachot and the accompanying blessings of marriage. Like, we'll look at the ceremony and also the Ketubah.
Good, good.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I look forward to that.
All right.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Erev Tov.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov, Shabbat.
Erev
Shabbat
Tov.
And Chodesh Tov.
Laila Tov.
It is also.
Tomorrow night if it's all good.